Rain poured mercilessly over the small gathering at St. Mary's churchyard in the outskirts of London. The year was 1865, and despite the unseasonable chill of early spring, Evangeline Blackwood stood motionless before her father's freshly dug grave. Her black mourning dress, hastily altered from one of her mother's old gowns, clung to her slender frame as the downpour intensified. She had not shed a single tear, not because she felt nothing, but because she had exhausted her supply of tears during the 3 weeks her father had suffered from pneumonia before finally surrendering to death's cold embrace. "Such a pity," came the honeyed voice of her stepmother, Lady Cecilia Blackwood, who stood beside her beneath a large black umbrella held by a servant. "Your father was so concerned about securing your future. He quite literally worried himself to death over what would become of you." Evangeline remained silent, her eyes fixed on the mahogany coffin as it was lowered into the ground. Her father, once a respected merchant with connections to the nobility, had left them nearly destitute after a series of unfortunate investments. The modest country home they had occupied was now to be sold to pay creditors, leaving Evangeline at the mercy of her stepmother, a woman who had never concealed her disdain for her husband's daughter from his first marriage. "I suppose I shall have to take you in," Lady Cecilia continued, her voice carrying just enough to be heard by the small gathering of mourners, "though what I shall do with you, I cannot imagine. At 22, with no fortune, no connections of your own, and," her eyes swept critically over Evangeline's face, "such ordinary features. I dare say you'll end up a governess or perhaps a companion to some elderly relation of mine. No gentleman of quality would consider you for marriage." The words cut deep, but Evangeline kept her composure, refusing to give her stepmother the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. She was not beautiful in the conventional sense, with her auburn hair and hazel eyes that seemed too large for her face, but she had been raised to value character over appearance. Still, in London society, character rarely secured proposals of marriage without the accompaniment of beauty or fortune. "The arrangements have already been made," Lady Cecilia whispered, as the vicar began the final prayers. "You'll accompany me to London tomorrow. My sister requires a lady's companion, and you shall fill that role until a more permanent situation can be found." Evangeline felt the ground beneath her shift, though she remained outwardly composed. Her father's death had rendered her position in society precarious, but to be relegated to the status of a paid companion to her stepmother's disagreeable sister seemed a particularly cruel twist of fate. She had harbored dreams of marriage, of children, of a home filled with laughter and love, but those dreams now seemed as distant as the sun behind the rain-laden clouds. As the final words of the burial service echoed across the churchyard, the small gathering began to disperse, eager to escape the worsening weather. Evangeline remained by the grave, unwilling to leave her father's side just yet. She was vaguely aware of carriages departing and umbrellas being folded as people hurried to the waiting funeral luncheon at the village inn. "Miss Blackwood," a deep voice called from behind her, "you'll catch your death in this rain." She turned to find herself facing a tall figure, obscured partially by the mist of rain, holding out a large black umbrella toward her. As he stepped closer, Evangeline's breath caught in her throat. She recognized him immediately, though they had never been formally introduced. Alexander Northcote, the Duke of Harrington, stood before her, his imposing height and broad shoulders cutting a formidable silhouette against the grey sky. His presence at her father's modest funeral was unexpected, to say the least. The Duke was known for his vast estates, his influence in Parliament, and his notorious reluctance to participate in society functions. What business could have possibly brought him to the funeral of a failed merchant? "Your Grace," Evangeline curtsied awkwardly, water dripping from her sodden skirts, "you honor my father with your presence, though I confess I did not know you were acquainted." The Duke's expression was unreadable, his sharp features set in a mask of polite solemnity. "Your father and I had business dealings in the past. I came to pay my respects." He extended the umbrella further, sheltering her from the relentless downpour. "Please allow me to escort you to your carriage." Before Evangeline could respond, the shrill voice of her stepmother cut through the rain. "Evangeline, we are leaving this instant." Lady Cecilia stood by her carriage, her face a picture of impatience and growing confusion as she noted the Duke's presence. "It appears I am being summoned," Evangeline said, offering a small, grateful smile to the Duke. "Thank you for your kindness, Your Grace." She made to move past him, but his gloved hand gently caught her arm. "Miss Blackwood," he said, his voice lowered so that only she could hear, "I knew your father better than you might imagine. He spoke often of you with great pride. If you should ever find yourself in need of assistance, you may call upon me." Evangeline stared at him, bewildered by this unexpected offer from a man so far above her in station. "That is most generous, Your Grace, but Evangeline." Her stepmother's voice had risen an octave. "Good day, Your Grace," Evangeline said hurriedly, curtsying once more before hurrying across the muddy churchyard to where Lady Cecilia waited, a look of furious suspicion on her face. "What business could the Duke of Harrington possibly have with you?" Lady Cecilia hissed as she practically dragged Evangeline into the carriage. "Do not think to rise above your station, girl. Men of his rank do not marry penniless orphans, regardless of what pretty words they might whisper at funerals." Evangeline said nothing, her mind still reeling from the encounter. As the carriage pulled away from the churchyard, she could not help but glance back through the rain-streaked window. The Duke still stood by her father's grave, a solitary, commanding figure in the downpour, watching as she was carried away. The journey to London the following day was a somber affair. Evangeline sat in silence as the countryside gave way to the sprawling, smoke-filled expanse of the capital. Lady Cecilia had scarcely spoken to her since the funeral, save to remind her of her new, lowly position and the gratitude she ought to feel for being provided for at all. Lady Cecilia's London residence was a fashionable townhouse in Mayfair, a testament to the wealth her father had once possessed and the social connections her stepmother had cultivated through her first two marriages. Evangeline was shown to a small, sparsely furnished room on the top floor, clearly intended for a servant rather than a family member. "You will take your meals in the kitchen," Lady Cecilia informed her as Evangeline placed her modest trunk at the foot of the narrow bed. "Tomorrow we shall call upon my sister, Lady Wrexham, to discuss the terms of your employment. I expect you to be grateful for whatever arrangement is made." Evangeline nodded, too weary to argue. She had spent the night after the funeral packing up her few belongings and burning her father's letters in the fireplace, watching as his familiar handwriting turned to ash. She had salvaged only a small miniature portrait of her mother and a worn copy of Shakespeare's sonnets that her father had given her on her 16th birthday. Left alone in the drafty room, Evangeline moved to the window, gazing out at the unfamiliar London skyline. Somewhere in this vast city was the Duke of Harrington, a man who had shown her more kindness in a brief encounter than her stepmother had in years of forced companionship. His offer of assistance played in her mind, though she knew she would never be desperate enough to impose upon the good nature of a man so far removed from her own sphere of existence. The following morning dawned grey and misty, a fitting backdrop to Evangeline's mood as she dressed in her one decent day dress, a sombre navy blue that had belonged to her mother. Lady Cecilia had arranged for them to take tea with her sister, Lady Wrexham, at 11 o'clock, and Evangeline knew that her future would be decided over delicate china cups and small, insubstantial sandwiches. Lady Wrexham's home was a grand affair in a fashionable square, its imposing facade speaking of old money and established lineage. Evangeline followed Lady Cecilia into an opulently decorated drawing room where Lady Wrexham reclined on a chaise longue, a small lapdog curled at her feet. "My dear Cecilia," Lady Wrexham greeted her sister with air kisses that never quite touched either cheek. "And this must be the unfortunate stepdaughter you mentioned." Her gaze raked over Evangeline with undisguised assessment. "She's rather plain, isn't she? I suppose that's for the best. I won't have to worry about her attempting to catch the eye of any eligible gentleman." Evangeline forced herself to curtsy, swallowing her pride. "It's a pleasure to make your acquaintance, Lady Wrexham." "Yes, well," Lady Wrexham waved a dismissive hand. "Sit down, girl. Let us discuss what duties you shall perform in exchange for your room and board." The discussion that followed was less a negotiation and more a recitation of demands. Evangeline would serve as Lady Wrexham's personal reader, companion on walks, letter writer, and general dog's body. She would receive no wages, only room, board, and the occasional cast-off garment. She would be expected to be available at all hours, with one half-day off per month. She would not attend social functions except as Lady Wrexham's shadow, and she would not engage in conversation with guests unless directly addressed. "It seems a fair arrangement," Lady Cecilia concluded, clearly pleased with the terms. "When shall she begin?" "Immediately," Lady Wrexham declared. "I am holding a small dinner party this evening, and I shall need her to help arrange the flowers and place cards," and so it was decided. Evangeline's life as she had known it was over, replaced by a new existence, as little more than a well-spoken servant to her stepmother's sister. She would be fed and housed, but her dreams of marriage, of a family of her own, were to be sacrificed on the altar of necessity. The dinner party that evening was an elaborate affair, with 20 of London's most fashionable individuals in attendance. Evangeline, dressed in a borrowed black gown that marked her as neither servant nor guest, moved silently around the edges of the gathering, refilling wine glasses, adjusting floral arrangements, and fetching items as Lady Wrexham imperiously demanded them. She was returning from the kitchen with a fresh tray of sweetmeats when she nearly collided with a latecomer entering the drawing room. Strong hands steadied her, preventing the tray from toppling. "Careful, miss." The deep voice stopped abruptly, and Evangeline looked up into the startled face of the Duke of Harrington. "Miss Blackwood," he said, his surprise evident. "I did not expect to find you here." Evangeline felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. "Your Grace, I am assisting Lady Wrexham this evening." Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed swiftly by something that looked remarkably like anger. Before he could speak further, Lady Wrexham swooped down upon them, her face alight with pleasure at securing such an illustrious guest. "Your Grace, how delightful that you could join us after all. I had quite given up hope when your secretary sent his regrets." The Duke's eyes remained on Evangeline for a moment longer, before he turned to address their hostess. "Lady Wrexham, my plans changed unexpectedly. I trust I haven't caused too much inconvenience by arriving unannounced." "Not at all, not at all," Lady Wrexham tittered, linking her arm through the Duke's and drawing him away. "Come, you must meet Lord and Lady Pembroke. They've just returned from Venice and have the most scandalous stories to tell." Evangeline watched them go, her heart hammering in her chest. The Duke had seemed genuinely displeased to find her in such a position, though whether out of concern for her welfare or embarrassment at encountering her in such reduced circumstances, she could not say. Throughout the evening, she was aware of his gaze following her as she moved about the room. Once, when Lady Wrexham had sharply reprimanded her for not responding quickly enough to a summons, she had glanced up to find the Duke watching, his expression thunderous. She had quickly lowered her eyes, mortified that he should witness her humiliation. As the evening drew to a close and guests began to depart, Evangeline found herself momentarily alone in the small anteroom adjoining the drawing room, arranging discarded wraps and retrieving forgotten fans. The door opened behind her and she turned, expecting to find Lady Wrexham with some new demand. Instead, the Duke of Harrington stood in the doorway, his tall frame blocking the exit. "Miss Blackwood," he said without preamble, "this situation is untenable. Your father would be appalled to see you reduced to such circumstances." Evangeline straightened, pride stiffening her spine despite her exhaustion. "I am grateful for Lady Wrexham's generosity in providing me with employment, Your Grace. Not all of us have the luxury of choosing our path in life." "Generosity?" The Duke's voice was low and dangerous. "Is that what you call it when a woman of means exploits the misfortune of her own relation? This is not employment, Miss Blackwood. This is servitude bordering on cruelty. Nevertheless, it is my reality now," Evangeline replied, her voice steady despite the lump forming in her throat. "I have no fortune, no connections, no skills that would command a better position. I am doing what I must to survive." The Duke stepped closer, his expression softening. "Your father entrusted me with certain matters before his death. I had not realized until tonight how dire your circumstances had become." He hesitated, seeming to choose his words with care. "I have a proposition for you, Miss Blackwood. One that would honor your father's memory and provide you with the security he wished for you." Evangeline's heart skipped a beat. "A proposition, Your Grace?" "Yes," he said firmly, "but this is neither the time nor the place to discuss it. I shall call upon you tomorrow morning. Will you grant me an audience?" Before she could respond, the door behind him opened, and Lady Wrexham appeared, her eyes narrowing suspiciously as she took in the scene. "Your Grace, I believe your carriage awaits." "Evangeline, why are you not assisting the maids with the clearing up?" The Duke turned, his expression instantly resuming its usual inscrutable mask. "Lady Wrexham, I was just thanking Miss Blackwood for her assistance this evening. She dropped her handkerchief earlier, and I was returning it to her." With a smooth motion, he produced a fine linen handkerchief from his pocket and handed it to Evangeline. It was clearly not hers. The delicate H embroidered in one corner marked it as his own, but Evangeline accepted it with a murmured thank you, tucking it into her sleeve. "How gallant," Lady Wrexham said, clearly unconvinced. "Evangeline, you are needed in the kitchen immediately." "Yes, Lady Wrexham." Evangeline curtsied to both of them and hurried from the room, the Duke's handkerchief burning against her skin like a promise. The next morning dawned bright and clear, a rare sunny day in London's usually gloomy spring. Evangeline had slept little, her mind churning with possibilities and fears. What proposition could the Duke possibly have for her, and how could she possibly meet with him without incurring Lady Wrexham's wrath? She needn't have worried about the latter. Shortly after breakfast, a magnificent carriage bearing the Harrington crest arrived at the front door. Lady Wrexham, intrigued by this unexpected visit from one of London's most eligible bachelors, received the Duke in the main drawing-room, summoning Evangeline to serve tea. Evangeline entered the room with the tea tray, her hands trembling slightly as she set it down on the small table between Lady Wrexham and the Duke. Your Grace, to what do we owe this unexpected pleasure? Lady Wrexham simpered, accepting a cup of tea from Evangeline's steady hands. The Duke declined the offered tea with a small shake of his head. I have come on a matter of business, Lady Wrexham. Business concerning Miss Blackwood. Lady Wrexham's eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline. Evangeline, whatever business could you possibly have with a penniless orphan, Your Grace? That is precisely what I have come to discuss. The Duke rose to his feet, his imposing height seeming to fill the room. Miss Blackwood's father entrusted certain matters to me before his death. Among them was a request that I look after his daughter's welfare, should anything happen to him. Evangeline stared at him, astonished. Her father had never mentioned any such arrangement. I see, Lady Wrexham said, clearly not seeing at all. And what does this guardianship entail exactly? It entails ensuring that Miss Blackwood is properly situated according to her station and her father's wishes. The Duke turned to Evangeline, his expression softening slightly. Miss Blackwood, your father wished for you to have a season in London, to be properly introduced to society, and to have the opportunity to make a suitable match. He set aside funds for this purpose, which were to be administered by me in the event of his death. Evangeline's mind reeled. This was impossible. Her father had died nearly destitute. There had been no funds for such a purpose. What game was the Duke playing? Well, Lady Wrexham said, her voice brittle with barely suppressed annoyance, this is most unexpected. However, I must point out that Evangeline has no experience of society, no proper wardrobe, and no female relation to sponsor her. A season would be quite impossible under the circumstances. On the contrary, the Duke replied smoothly, I have already spoken to my aunt, the Dowager Duchess of Harrington, who has agreed to sponsor Miss Blackwood for the season. As for a wardrobe, the funds your brother-in-law set aside are more than sufficient to provide everything necessary. Evangeline found her voice at last. Your Grace, I had no knowledge of any such arrangement. My father never spoke of it. The Duke's gaze locked with hers, a silent message passing between them. It was his wish that you not be burdened with financial concerns, Miss Blackwood. He wanted only for you to have the opportunities that your birth and breeding deserve. Lady Wrexham's face had turned an interesting shade of puce. This is most irregular. Evangeline has obligations here. She has agreed to serve as my companion. An agreement made under duress is no agreement at all, the Duke said, his voice steely. Miss Blackwood will be residing with my aunt at Harrington House for the duration of the season. Her belongings can be sent there this afternoon. He turned back to Evangeline, his expression softening once more. That is, if the arrangement meets with your approval, Miss Blackwood. Evangeline's mind raced. She knew full well that her father had left no such funds, that the Duke was offering her a chance at a life she had thought forever beyond her reach, for reasons she could not begin to fathom. Yet to refuse would be to condemn herself to a lifetime of servitude to a woman who viewed her as little more than a convenient piece of furniture. It meets with my approval, Your Grace, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. I am grateful for your guardianship and for your attention to my father's wishes. Lady Wrexham sputtered incoherently, but the Duke paid her no mind. Excellent. My aunt's carriage will call for you at 2 o'clock. I suggest you use the intervening time to pack your belongings. He bowed formally to both women. Good day, ladies. Miss Blackwood, I shall call upon you at Harrington House tomorrow to discuss further details. With that he departed, leaving Evangeline to face the full force of Lady Wrexham's fury. But for the first time since her father's death, Evangeline felt a flicker of hope ignite in her heart. True to the Duke's word, a carriage bearing the Harrington crest arrived precisely at 2 o'clock. By then, Evangeline had endured hours of Lady Wrexham's vitriolic complaints about ingratitude and conniving behavior, none of which had diminished her determination to accept the Duke's offer of escape. She gathered her few belongings into her father's old trunk and descended to the waiting carriage, her head held high despite Lady Wrexham's parting shot. You'll rue this day, girl. Men like the Duke don't offer charity without expecting something in return. Mark my words, he'll ruin you before the season is out. The Dowager Duchess of Harrington was not what Evangeline had expected. Rather than the stern, forbidding figure she had imagined, she found herself greeted by a diminutive woman with twinkling eyes and a warm smile. My dear Miss Blackwood, the Dowager said, taking Evangeline's hands in her own as she entered the magnificent drawing-room of Harrington House. How pleased I am to meet you at last. Alexander has told me so much about you. Evangeline curtsied deeply. Your Grace, I cannot express my gratitude for your kindness in receiving me. Nonsense. The Dowager waved a dismissive hand. It is my pleasure, and you must call me Lady Margaret, my dear. Your Grace makes me feel positively ancient. Over tea served in delicate porcelain cups, Lady Margaret explained that Evangeline would be presented at court as her ward, that a seamstress had been engaged to create a suitable wardrobe, and that dancing and deportment masters would call daily to prepare her for the rigors of the London season. But surely, Evangeline ventured hesitantly, such expenses far exceed any funds my father could have set aside. I cannot accept such generosity without understanding the full circumstances. Lady Margaret's expression grew serious. My dear, Alexander will explain everything when he calls tomorrow. For now, rest assured that all is being done in accordance with your father's wishes. Evangeline was shown to a beautifully appointed chamber on the second floor, where a maid had already unpacked her meagre belongings. The contrast between this luxurious room and the cramped servants' quarters she had occupied at Lady Wrexham's could not have been more stark. As promised, the Duke called the following afternoon. Evangeline received him in the small morning room, where Lady Margaret discreetly left them alone after the initial greetings. Miss Blackwood, the Duke began, seeming uncharacteristically hesitant. I owe you an explanation. Yes, Your Grace, you do, Evangeline replied, gathering her courage. I am well aware that my father left no funds for a London season. What is the true nature of this arrangement? The Duke's expression was grave as he met her gaze. Your father and I were more than business associates, Miss Blackwood. We were friends. When he realized the extent of his financial difficulties, he came to me for assistance. I offered to help, but he was too proud to accept charity. Instead, he asked that I look after you, should anything happen to him. He paused, his hands clasped behind his back as he paced the small room. I had no idea that your stepmother would treat you so abominably, or that you would be forced into what amounted to servitude. When I saw you at Lady Wrexham's dinner party, I knew I had to honor my promise to your father in a more direct manner than I had initially intended. Evangeline studied him, trying to discern the truth in his words. That explains your intervention, Your Grace, but not the extravagance of a London season. Surely a modest position as a governess or companion in a respectable household would have fulfilled your obligation to my father. The Duke's lips quirked in what might have been a smile. Perhaps, but I have observed that the position of governess or companion is rarely conducive to making an advantageous marriage, and your father was most explicit in his desire that you have the opportunity to marry well. I see, Evangeline said, though in truth she did not see at all. And your aunt is willing to sponsor a complete stranger for an entire season out of the goodness of her heart. My aunt, the Duke replied with a genuine smile this time, has been attempting to draw me into society for years. She sees in you an opportunity to achieve that aim, as I will naturally be obliged to attend the same functions as my ward. So I am to be a lure to bring the elusive Duke of Harrington into the marriage mart, Evangeline said, a hint of amusement coloring her voice despite her confusion. A rather convoluted scheme, if I may say so. Indeed, the Duke agreed, his smile fading. But there is more to it than that, Miss Blackwood. He took a deep breath as if steeling himself. The truth is, I made a very specific promise to your father. I promised that I would ensure you had the opportunity to make a suitable marriage, and if no suitable offer was forthcoming by the end of the season, I promised that I would offer for you myself. Evangeline stared at him, certain she had misheard. I beg your pardon? It was a contingency, nothing more, the Duke hastened to add. Your father believed that with proper introduction to society, you would surely receive multiple offers. He merely sought to ensure that in the worst case, you would not be left without options. And you agreed to this contingency? Evangeline's voice had risen despite her best efforts to remain composed. To marry a woman you had never met, solely to honor a promise to a friend? The Duke had the grace to look uncomfortable. I had met you, Miss Blackwood, briefly at a musical some 3 years ago. Your father introduced us, though I doubt you remember the encounter. You were playing the pianoforte rather brilliantly, as I recall. Evangeline did remember vaguely. A crowded room, her father's proud smile as he presented her to a tall, imposing figure. She had been too nervous about her performance to pay much attention to the introduction. Nevertheless, she said, rising to her feet, I cannot accept such an arrangement. It is one thing to accept your assistance in honoring my father's wish that I have a season, quite another to enter into that season with the understanding that you stand as a safety net, should I fail to attract a more suitable match. The Duke raised an eyebrow. More suitable? I assure you, Miss Blackwood, there are few matches in England more suitable than a duke. That is precisely my point, Evangeline retorted, her cheeks flushing. You are a duke. I am the penniless daughter of a failed merchant. There is no world in which such a match would be considered suitable by society. Society's opinion concerns me far less than you might imagine, the Duke said dryly. In any case, this is all rather premature. You will have your season. You will be introduced to any number of eligible gentlemen, and at the end of it all, you will make your own choice. I merely wish you to know that should you find yourself without options that please you, I stand ready to honor my promise to your father." Evangeline sank back into her chair, her mind reeling. "This is madness," she murmured. "Perhaps," the Duke agreed, his expression softening as he regarded her. "But it is a madness born of friendship and honor, Miss Blackwood. Your father saved my life once, many years ago. This is the least I can do to repay that debt." Evangeline looked up sharply. "Saved your life? How?" The Duke's face closed like a book being shut. "That is a story for another time. For now, I ask only that you accept the opportunity before you with an open heart. Enjoy your season, Miss Blackwood. Dance, flirt, fall in love if you are so inclined. My promise to your father need only be invoked if you find yourself without a more appealing prospect at season's end." Put that way, it seemed less an imposition and more a gift, the gift of freedom to choose her own path without the spectre of destitution hanging over her. "Very well, Your Grace," she said at last. "I accept your terms, but I wish it to be understood that I do not consider you bound to your promise should I fail to make a match. I would not have you sacrifice your own happiness for my father's peace of mind." The Duke regarded her thoughtfully. "Your concern for my happiness is touching, Miss Blackwood, but unnecessary. I assure you I entered into the promise with full knowledge of its implications." He bowed formally. "I shall leave you now to your preparations. Lady Margaret has arranged for you to be presented at court next week, after which the season will begin in earnest. I look forward to observing your progress." With that enigmatic statement he departed, leaving Evangeline to ponder the strange twist her life had taken. From near servitude to the ward of a duchess in the space of a day, with the promise or threat of a ducal proposal looming at the season's end should she fail to attract another suitor. It was, as she had said, madness. And yet, as the days passed and she was fitted for gowns, instructed in the finer points of court etiquette, and tutored in the latest dances, Evangeline found herself embracing the madness with increasing enthusiasm. The night of her presentation at court arrived all too quickly. Evangeline stood before the mirror in her chamber, scarcely recognizing the young woman who gazed back at her. The court dress was a masterpiece of ivory silk and Brussels lace, the required ostrich feathers trembling in her carefully arranged hair. Lady Margaret had insisted on lending her a set of diamond earrings and a matching necklace to complete the effect. "You look magnificent," Lady Margaret declared, entering the room in her own court regalia. "Alexander will be quite overcome." Evangeline turned from the mirror, her heart fluttering at the mention of the Duke. In the weeks since their strange agreement, she had seen little of him, though she was aware of his presence in the house from the hushed conversations between servants and the occasional glimpse of his tall figure striding through the entrance hall. "Is His Grace to accompany us this evening?" she asked, striving for nonchalance. Lady Margaret's eyes twinkled knowingly. "Indeed, he awaits us below. It is not every day that one's ward is presented at court, after all." The Duke was indeed waiting in the entrance hall, resplendent in formal court dress, his customary reserve softened by a look of genuine appreciation as Evangeline descended the stairs. "Miss Blackwood," he said, bowing over her gloved hand, "you do Lady Margaret's tutelage proud." "Thank you, Your Grace," Evangeline replied, cursing the blush that rose to her cheeks at his touch, "though I fear I may disgrace you both by tripping over my train or forgetting the proper curtsy." "Nonsense," Lady Margaret declared, accepting her nephew's arm. "You have practiced until you could perform the curtsy in your sleep. You will be the picture of grace." The presentation passed in a blur of nervous tension and rigid protocol. Evangeline managed the elaborate curtsy without mishap, spoke her few required words clearly, and withdrew without incident. It was only afterward, at the small supper Lady Margaret had arranged to celebrate the occasion, that the significance of the evening truly struck her. "You are now officially a part of society, my dear," Lady Margaret informed her as they raised their glasses in a toast. "The real work begins tomorrow with Lady Ashcroft's ball. Every eligible bachelor in London will be in attendance, eager to dance with the newest debutante." Evangeline glanced at the Duke, who had been unusually quiet throughout the meal. "Will you be in attendance as well, Your Grace?" He met her gaze with an enigmatic smile. "I would not miss it for the world, Miss Blackwood. Someone must ensure that you are not overwhelmed by your admirers." Lady Ashcroft's ball was everything Evangeline had been led to expect, a glittering assemblage of London's elite, gathered in a ballroom ablaze with candlelight and resounding with the music of a full orchestra. Dressed in a new gown of pale blue silk that Lady Margaret assured her brought out the gold flecks in her hazel eyes, Evangeline entered on the Dowager Duchess's arm, the Duke following a few steps behind. Their entrance caused a stir, as Lady Margaret had predicted it would. The appearance of the reclusive Duke of Harrington at a society function was noteworthy enough. His arrival in the company of a beautiful young woman, previously unknown to society, set tongues wagging immediately. "Who is she?" Evangeline heard one young lady whisper to another as they passed. "And why is she with the Duke and his aunt?" "Some relation from the country, I expect," came the dismissive reply, "though she's pretty enough, in a common sort of way." Evangeline held her head high, determined not to let such comments dampen her spirits. Lady Margaret steered her toward their hostess, made the necessary introductions, and then settled herself in a comfortable chair among the other dowagers, leaving Evangeline standing somewhat awkwardly at the edge of the ballroom. She did not remain alone for long. Within moments, a young man approached, introduced himself as Lord Pembroke's son, and requested the honor of the next dance. Before she could even respond, another gentleman appeared at her side, then another, until she found herself surrounded by a small crowd of eager suitors. From across the room, Evangeline was aware of the Duke watching the scene with an unreadable expression. She accepted Lord Pembroke's son for the first dance, a lively country dance that left her breathless and laughing. Her second partner, a Mr. Harrington, no relation to the Duke, he assured her hastily, was less accomplished but made up for his clumsy footwork with amusing conversation. Her third partner, a Viscount whose name she immediately forgot in her nervousness, spent the entire dance extolling the virtues of his hunting dogs. By the time the fourth dance was announced, Evangeline's dance card was filled for the entire evening, a fact that seemed to both please and irritate Lady Margaret. "You've caused quite a sensation," the Dowager Duchess remarked during a brief respite between dances, "though I notice my nephew has yet to claim a dance." Evangeline glanced across the room to where the Duke stood in conversation with an older gentleman, his tall figure commanding attention even in the crowded ballroom. "His Grace has shown no indication of wishing to dance, Lady Margaret, hasn't he?" Lady Margaret's eyes twinkled. "Perhaps you should look more closely at your dance card, my dear." Puzzled, Evangeline examined the small ivory card hanging from her wrist. There, inscribed in a bold, masculine hand for the supper dance, the most coveted position of the evening, was the name Harrington. Her pulse quickened inexplicably. "I don't remember His Grace requesting this dance." "He didn't," Lady Margaret confided with a conspiratorial smile. "He took the liberty of adding his name while you were occupied with your first partner. Most presumptuous of him. But then, he is a duke." Before Evangeline could respond, her next partner appeared to claim her for a waltz. As he led her onto the floor, she found her gaze drawn repeatedly to the Duke, who now watched the dancers with an intensity that made her cheeks flush. The evening progressed in a whirl of music, conversation, and increasingly aching feet. Evangeline found herself the object of admiration from young men who, a month earlier, would have walked past her in the street without a second glance. It was a heady experience, though she reminded herself that their attention was likely due more to her connection with the Duke and his aunt than to any sudden increase in her own charms. As the orchestra struck up the opening notes of the supper dance, Evangeline's current partner reluctantly relinquished her hand. She turned to find the Duke standing before her, his expression inscrutable as he offered a formal bow. "Miss Blackwood, I believe this dance is mine." She curtsied in return, her heart inexplicably racing. "Your Grace, I confess I was surprised to find your name on my card." "Were you?" He led her onto the dance floor, one hand at the small of her back sending a curious warmth through her despite the layers of fabric between his palm and her skin. "I thought my intentions were clear from the beginning." "Your intentions to honor a promise to my father, yes," Evangeline replied, falling into step with him as the dance began. "But not your intentions to dance with me at my first ball." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "The two are not unrelated. If I am to stand as your safety net, as you so charmingly put it, I should at least determine whether we are compatible on the dance floor." Evangeline felt her cheeks warm. "And what is your assessment thus far, Your Grace?" "Most favorable," he replied, his hand tightening slightly at her waist as he guided her through a turn. "You dance as gracefully as you play the pianoforte. You remember that?" She looked up at him in surprise. "I remember more than you might imagine, Miss Blackwood." His gaze was intense, searching her face for something she could not name. "I remember a young woman whose talent and modesty impressed me far more than the practiced flirtations of the season's debutantes. I remember thinking that your father was right to be proud of you." Evangeline's heart stuttered in her chest. "You are too kind, Your Grace." "On the contrary," he said, his voice lowering as he drew her marginally closer than the dance strictly required. "I am rarely kind without cause. You have made quite an impression this evening. I count no fewer than 5 gentlemen who appear ready to fall at your feet, including young Lord Thornfield, who has been watching us with undisguised envy for the past 5 minutes. Evangeline followed his gaze to a handsome young man standing at the edge of the dance floor, his expression indeed rather forlorn as he observed them. Lord Thornfield was very attentive during our dance. No doubt, the Duke said dryly. His attentiveness is legendary among the debutantes, as is his lack of fortune and his propensity for gambling. Evangeline frowned. You make him sound most unsuitable. For a young woman without independent means. Yes, I would say he is decidedly unsuitable. The Duke's expression softened at her evident disappointment. Forgive me, it is not my place to pass judgment on your admirers, isn't it? Evangeline countered, emboldened by the success of the evening. As my self-appointed guardian, surely it is precisely your place to advise me on the suitability of potential suitors. The Duke's lips quirked in what might have been a smile. Perhaps, but I find I am reluctant to discourage your enjoyment of the season by casting a shadow over every young man who shows an interest in you. How magnanimous, Evangeline murmured, though there was no real bite to her words. The dance brought them closer, then apart, their conversation fragmenting as the patterns of the dance separated them momentarily. When they came together again, the Duke's expression had grown serious. I spoke with Lady Wrexham earlier this evening. Evangeline tensed. Indeed, I hope she was not too vitriolic in her assessment of my character. On the contrary, the Duke said, guiding her smoothly through another turn. She was most effusive in her praise. It seems that upon reflection, she has realized what a treasure she nearly lost in you. Evangeline could not help but laugh. How convenient for her that she has experienced this revelation only after I have been established under your aunt's protection. Quite, the Duke agreed, his eyes warming with amusement. I suspect her change of heart has more to do with the gossip currently circulating the room than any genuine remorse. Gossip? Evangeline echoed, suddenly wary. The Duke nodded, his expression once more grave. It seems that our arrangement has given rise to certain expectations. Lady Wrexham was quick to hint that she had always suspected a tender attachment between us, despite the difference in our stations. Evangeline nearly missed a step. She what? Indeed. The Duke steadied her with a firm hand. Apparently my appearance at your father's funeral, followed by my intervention in your living arrangements, has led to the conclusion that I harbor romantic intentions toward you. But that's absurd, Evangeline protested, her voice low but vehement. You have made it perfectly clear that your actions are motivated solely by a promise to my father. Have I? The Duke's gaze was suddenly intent, searching. Perhaps I have not been as clear as I thought. Before Evangeline could respond, the music drew to a close. The Duke bowed formally over her hand, his lips brushing her gloved knuckles in a gesture that sent an inexplicable shiver down her spine. I believe it is time for supper, Miss Blackwood. May I escort you to the dining room? Still rattled by his enigmatic words, Evangeline allowed him to lead her from the dance floor. As they made their way toward the supper room, she was acutely aware of the curious glances and whispered comments that followed them. It seemed Lady Wrexham was not the only one to have drawn conclusions about the nature of their relationship. Supper was a strained affair, though the Duke maintained a facade of polite conversation throughout. Evangeline found herself seated between him and Lord Thornfield, the latter making no secret of his admiration, despite the Duke's earlier warnings about his character. You dance divinely, Miss Blackwood, Lord Thornfield declared, his handsome face alight with genuine appreciation. I have not enjoyed a waltz so thoroughly in an age. Thank you, my lord, Evangeline replied, conscious of the Duke's silent presence on her other side. You are too kind. Not at all, Lord Thornfield insisted. I speak only the truth. Indeed, I wonder if I might call upon you tomorrow. There is a delightful exhibition of botanical paintings at Somerset House that I think you might enjoy. Before Evangeline could respond, the Duke spoke, his voice deceptively casual. I fear Miss Blackwood is otherwise engaged tomorrow, Thornfield. My aunt has arranged for her to accompany us to the opera. Lord Thornfield's expression fell momentarily before he rallied. The day after, perhaps. I believe that is the day of Lady Montrose's garden party, the Duke replied smoothly. Miss Blackwood has already accepted an invitation. Evangeline turned to the Duke, a spark of irritation flaring in her chest. I was not aware that my schedule was so full, Your Grace. No? The Duke raised an eyebrow, his expression blandly innocent. I'm certain Lady Margaret mentioned these engagements to you. She had not, and from the glint in the Duke's eye, Evangeline suspected he knew it perfectly well. Even so, she said with deliberate sweetness, surely there must be some afternoon when I'm at liberty to view the exhibition with Lord Thornfield. The Duke's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course. I merely wished to save you the embarrassment of having to decline an invitation due to prior commitments. Lady Margaret keeps a detailed calendar of your engagements. Perhaps Lord Thornfield would be good enough to consult with her to find a suitable date. Lord Thornfield, sensing the undercurrents of tension, glanced between them with poorly concealed curiosity. I should be delighted to consult with the Dowager Duchess. In fact, I shall seek her out directly after supper. The remainder of the meal passed in a haze of strained small talk, with the Duke responding to Lord Thornfield's attempts at conversation with increasingly terse monosyllables. By the time they returned to the ballroom, Evangeline was thoroughly confused by the Duke's behavior. If he truly wished her to make a suitable match during the season, why would he so deliberately interfere with her first potential suitor? As the evening wore on, Evangeline found herself the center of attention among the eligible bachelors in attendance, a fact that seemed to darken the Duke's mood with each passing dance. By the time Lady Margaret signaled that it was time to depart, Evangeline had collected promises of calls from no fewer than 3 gentlemen, including Lord Thornfield, who had indeed secured the Dowager Duchess's permission to escort Evangeline to the exhibition 2 days hence. "You have made quite an impression," Lady Margaret observed as their carriage rolled away from Lady Ashcroft's residence. "I predict a most successful season." "Indeed," the Duke agreed, his voice oddly flat. "Miss Blackwood seems to have captivated half the young men in London with a single evening's acquaintance. My promise to her father may prove entirely unnecessary." Evangeline glanced at him sharply, but his expression, half hidden in the shadows of the carriage, revealed nothing of his thoughts. "I would not be so hasty to draw conclusions, Your Grace. Admiration at a ball does not necessarily translate to serious intentions." "Perhaps not," he conceded, "but it is a beginning, and Lord Thornfield at least seems quite determined in his pursuit." "Lord Thornfield is charming," Evangeline acknowledged, watching the Duke carefully for his reaction, "though you seemed to suggest earlier that he might not be a suitable match." "Did I?" The Duke's tone was carefully neutral. "I merely provided information that might be relevant to your decision. The choice, as I have said, is entirely yours." Lady Margaret glanced between them, a knowing smile playing about her lips. "I suspect the season will be most illuminating for all concerned. Now tell me, my dear, what did you think of Lady Ashcroft's new chandelier? Dreadfully ostentatious, was it not?" The subject was thus safely changed to more neutral topics for the remainder of the journey, but Evangeline could not help noticing that the Duke remained unusually silent, his gaze fixed on the passing streets of London, as if they held the answer to some perplexing question. The days that followed were a whirlwind of social engagements, each one bringing new admirers and invitations. Lord Thornfield proved as charming during their visit to Somerset House as he had been at the ball, his knowledge of botanical art impressive, and his attention to Evangeline's comfort unwavering. Under other circumstances, she might have been quite captivated by his handsome face and easy manners. Yet she found herself constantly comparing him to the Duke, whose presence in her life had become both a comfort and a confusion. Alexander Northcote, for she had begun to think of him by his Christian name, if only in the privacy of her thoughts, accompanied her and Lady Margaret to the opera as promised, where his quiet explanations of the Italian libretto enhanced her enjoyment of the performance immeasurably. At Lady Montrose's garden party, he had appeared at her side precisely when a particularly persistent suitor had begun to make her uncomfortable, offering his arm with a look that brooked no argument from the disappointed young man. It was a pattern that repeated itself throughout the early weeks of the season. The Duke would maintain a respectful distance, allowing her to enjoy the attentions of her various admirers, only to intervene with unerring timing whenever a situation threatened to become awkward or overwhelming. He never explained these interventions, merely escorted her to safety with a few murmured words of reassurance before disappearing once more into the background of her increasingly busy social life. Lord Thornfield's attentions, meanwhile, grew steadily more marked. He called at Harrington House almost daily, bringing small gifts of books or flowers, and securing Lady Margaret's permission to escort Evangeline on numerous outings to exhibitions, botanical gardens, and once, memorably, to a hot air balloon demonstration in Hyde Park. His conversation was invariably engaging, his manners impeccable, and his admiration evident to all who observed them together. "I believe Lord Thornfield is on the verge of making you an offer," Lady Margaret remarked one evening, as she helped Evangeline prepare for the Countess of Warwick's ball. "He has called upon my nephew twice this week, ostensibly to discuss agricultural improvements on his father's estate, but I suspect he was really seeking Alexander's blessing to court you formally." Evangeline's hand stilled in the act of fastening a pearl earring. "And did his Grace give his blessing?" Lady Margaret's expression was enigmatic. "Alexander is a man of honor, my dear. He would not stand in the way of a match that might bring you happiness." That is not an answer, Lady Margaret. The Dowager Duchess sighed, patting Evangeline's hand gently. No, it is not, but it is all I can give you. The rest must come from Alexander himself. The Countess of Warwick's ball was the most lavish event of the season thus far, with the great ballroom transformed into a veritable fairyland of flowers, crystal, and candlelight. Evangeline, dressed in a new gown of deep emerald silk that Lady Margaret had insisted brought out the auburn highlights in her hair, entered on the Duke's arm, Lady Margaret having pleaded a headache at the last moment. "I fear we have been manipulated," the Duke murmured as they descended the grand staircase, all eyes turning to observe their entrance. "My aunt's headache developed with suspicious timing." Evangeline glanced up at him, noting the faint lines of tension around his mouth. "Does it distress you so much to be seen alone in my company, Your Grace?" His gaze snapped to hers, surprise evident in his expression. "On the contrary, Miss Blackwood, I find your company far more pleasant than that of most of the ton. It is the speculation our appearance together will inevitably cause that concerns me." "Speculation about your intentions toward me," Evangeline clarified, her voice steady despite the sudden racing of her heart. "Precisely." The Duke guided her through the crowd with practiced ease, nodding acknowledgments to acquaintances as they passed. "Speculation that may limit your options should you wish to accept an offer from another gentleman, such as Lord Thornfield," Evangeline supplied. The Duke's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Among others, yes. I would not have my promise to your father become an impediment to your happiness." Before Evangeline could respond, they were intercepted by their hostess, the Countess of Warwick, a formidable woman whose shrewd gaze took in their linked arms with evident interest. "Your Grace, how delightful to see you, and Miss Blackwood, you look positively radiant this evening. I must say you make a most striking couple." The Duke's bow was impeccably correct, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. "Lady Warwick, Miss Blackwood is my aunt's ward, as you know. The Dowager Duchess sends her regrets but was unfortunately indisposed this evening." "How convenient," the Countess replied with a knowing smile. "Well, I shall leave you to enjoy the ball. I believe the first dance is about to begin." As their hostess moved away to greet other guests, the Duke turned to Evangeline with a rueful expression. "You see, the speculation begins already." Evangeline was saved from having to reply by the arrival of Lord Thornfield, resplendent in evening dress, his handsome face lighting up at the sight of her. "Miss Blackwood, you look absolutely enchanting." He bowed over her hand, his admiration evident in his gaze. "I believe you promised me the first dance?" She had, though she could not help noticing the way the Duke's posture stiffened at the reminder. "Indeed, Lord Thornfield. If you will excuse us, Your Grace." The Duke inclined his head with regal grace. "Of course. I shall seek you out for the supper dance, Miss Blackwood, if your card is not already full." "It is not," she assured him, allowing Lord Thornfield to lead her toward the dance floor. As they took their places for the country dance, Lord Thornfield glanced back at the Duke, who remained watching them with an unreadable expression. "His Grace seems unusually attentive this evening." Evangeline followed his gaze, a curious warmth spreading through her chest at the sight of the Duke's tall figure standing apart from the crowd, his eyes fixed on her. "His Grace takes his responsibilities as my guardian very seriously." "Guardian?" Lord Thornfield raised an eyebrow as the dance began. "Is that what he calls it? What do you mean?" Lord Thornfield guided her through a turn, his voice lowering confidentially. "There is talk, Miss Blackwood. Talk that the Duke's interest in you extends beyond mere guardianship." Evangeline felt her cheeks warm. "People will always gossip, Lord Thornfield. The truth is that His Grace made a promise to my father to ensure my welfare. Nothing more." "If you say so," Lord Thornfield replied, though his tone suggested skepticism. "I only mention it because my own interest in you is decidedly more than that of a casual acquaintance. I would not wish to tread on the Duke's territory, as it were." Evangeline stiffened. "I am not anyone's territory, my lord." "Poor choice of words," Lord Thornfield amended hastily. "I meant only that if there is an understanding between you and the Duke, I would not wish to intrude." "There is no understanding," Evangeline said firmly, though even as she spoke the words she wondered at their truth. Was there not, in fact, an understanding of sorts? A promise that at the end of the season, if no other suitable offer presented itself, the Duke would offer for her himself. Lord Thornfield's expression brightened considerably. "I am very glad to hear it. In that case, I wonder if I might speak with you privately later this evening, perhaps during the supper interval." Evangeline's pulse quickened. She had no doubt about the nature of the conversation Lord Thornfield wished to have. After weeks of marked attention, he was clearly preparing to make her an offer. It was precisely what she had hoped for at the beginning of the season, a chance at marriage to a handsome, charming gentleman who seemed genuinely enamored of her. And yet, I fear that would be impossible, she said, regret colouring her voice. I have promised the supper dance to His Grace. Lord Thornfield's disappointment was evident, though he rallied quickly. Another time, then. Perhaps you would permit me to call upon you tomorrow? Of course, Evangeline agreed, though with less enthusiasm than she might have expected to feel. The remainder of the dance passed in a blur of movement and casual conversation, but Evangeline's thoughts were elsewhere. By the time the music ended, and Lord Thornfield escorted her back to the edge of the ballroom, she had determined to seek out the Duke and clarify, once and for all, the nature of their arrangement. She found him in conversation with an elderly gentleman near the refreshment table, his expression one of polite interest that did not quite reach his eyes. He excused himself immediately upon noticing her approach. "Miss Blackwood, you seem troubled." Evangeline glanced around at the crowded ballroom, aware that they were under observation from numerous curious eyes. "I find I am in need of some air, Your Grace. Would you be so kind as to escort me to the terrace?" Understanding dawned in his eyes. Of course, the terrace was mercifully deserted, the spring night cool enough to discourage most guests from venturing outside. Evangeline moved to the stone balustrade, gazing out at the Countess's famed rose garden, now silvered by moonlight. "Lord Thornfield intends to offer for me," she said without preamble, her back still turned to the Duke. There was a moment of silence before he replied, his voice carefully neutral. "I suspected as much. He sought me out earlier this week, presumably to ascertain whether I would object to his courtship." Evangeline turned to face him, searching his expression in the dim light. "And would you object?" The Duke's face was a study in controlled emotion, his eyes shadowed beneath his brow. "It is not my place to object or approve, Miss Blackwood. As I have said repeatedly, the choice is entirely yours." "Is it?" Evangeline took a step toward him, emboldened by the privacy of their surroundings. "You claim to have no preference in the matter, yet you have systematically interfered with every attempt Lord Thornfield has made to be alone in my company. Have I?" The Duke's voice was low, a hint of something dangerous lurking beneath the calm surface. "Perhaps I was simply fulfilling my duty as your guardian." "Guardian," Evangeline repeated, frustration building in her chest. "A role you assumed based on a promise to my father, a promise that included the possibility of marriage between us should I fail to secure another suitable match." "Yes, and yet now that such a match presents itself, a handsome, charming Viscount's son who appears genuinely attached to me, you claim to have no opinion on the matter." Evangeline shook her head, her patience wearing thin. "I find that difficult to believe, Your Grace." The Duke's jaw tightened, a muscle ticking visibly beneath the skin. "What would you have me say, Miss Blackwood? That Thornfield is a gambler who has squandered half his allowance at the gaming tables? That his genuine attachment to you developed with suspicious timing after rumors of a substantial dowry began circulating? That he has expressed similar genuine attachments to no fewer than 3 heiresses in the past 2 seasons, only to withdraw his interest when their fortunes proved less substantial than reported?" Evangeline stared at him, shocked by the vehemence of his response. "Is that true?" "Every word," the Duke confirmed, his voice dropping to a near growl. "I have made inquiries as any responsible guardian would. Thornfield is charming, yes, and handsome enough to turn many a young lady's head. But his interest in you is not what it seems." "And what of your interest in me?" Evangeline demanded, stepping closer still, close enough to see the flare of surprise in his eyes. "Is that simply the result of a deathbed promise to my father? Or is there more to it that you have not seen fit to share with me?" For a long moment the Duke said nothing, his gaze searching her face, as if seeking the answer to some unspoken question. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "What would you have me say, Evangeline?" The use of her given name sent a shiver down her spine. "The truth, Alexander. I would have you tell me the truth." Another beat of silence, heavy with unspoken words. Then, with a suddenness that took her breath away, the Duke closed the remaining distance between them, one hand coming up to cradle her cheek with unexpected gentleness. "The truth," he murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips, "is that I made a promise to your father, yes, but the truth is also that I have watched you these past weeks with growing admiration, and something more, something I had not expected to feel." Evangeline's heart thundered in her chest, her breath catching as his thumb traced the curve of her cheekbone. "And what is that something, Your Grace?" His lips curved in a rueful smile. "I think, under the circumstances, you might call me Alexander." "Alexander," she whispered, savoring the taste of his name on her tongue. "What is it you feel?" Instead of answering in words, he lowered his head, hesitating a breath away from her lips, as if giving her a chance to pull away. When she didn't, he closed the final distance between them, capturing her mouth in a kiss so gentle yet so profound that Evangeline felt it down to her soul. It was brief, a mere whisper of contact, but when he pulled back, his eyes were dark with an emotion she had never seen there before. "I believe that answers your question, Evangeline." Before she could respond, the sound of approaching voices from the ballroom broke the spell between them. Alexander stepped back, his expression once more assuming its customary reserve, though his eyes still burned with unspoken feelings. "We should return to the ball," he said, offering his arm, "before our absence is noted and gives rise to even more speculation." Evangeline placed her hand on his sleeve, her mind still reeling from what had just transpired. "This conversation is not finished, Alexander." His gaze met hers, a promise in its depths. "No, it is not, but it must wait for a more private setting." They re-entered the ballroom just as the orchestra was announcing the supper dance. As Alexander led her onto the floor, Evangeline was acutely aware of Lord Thornfield watching from the sidelines, his expression one of thinly veiled disappointment. "I believe Lord Thornfield is somewhat put out by our dance," she murmured as they took their places. Alexander's lips quirked in what might have been a smile. "He will survive the disappointment, I assure you." The dance brought them together, then apart. The formal patterns a stark contrast to the tumult of emotions raging beneath Evangeline's calm exterior. Each time their hands touched, each time Alexander's gaze met hers, she felt a jolt of awareness that had nothing to do with the promise he had made to her father and everything to do with the man himself. As the music drew to a close, Alexander leaned in, his breath warm against her ear. "We will speak privately tomorrow. There is much I wish to say to you." Evangeline nodded, not trusting her voice in that moment. As he escorted her toward the supper room, she felt a curious lightness in her chest, as if something long constrained had finally broken free. The remainder of the evening passed in a haze of conversations and dances that Evangeline would later barely remember. She was aware of Lord Thornfield's increasingly desperate attempts to secure her attention, of Alexander's watchful presence nearby, of the speculative glances cast their way by the other guests, but none of it seemed to matter in the face of the revelation on the terrace. It was well past midnight when they finally took their leave, the carriage ride back to Harrington House, passing in a silence that was somehow both comfortable and charged with anticipation. Alexander escorted her to the foot of the stairs, bowing formally over her hand as propriety demanded. "Until tomorrow, Evangeline," he murmured, his lips brushing her gloved knuckles in a gesture that sent warmth coursing through her veins. "Until tomorrow, Alexander," she replied, reluctantly withdrawing her hand from his grasp. As she ascended the stairs to her chamber, Evangeline knew with sudden clarity that whatever Lord Thornfield might offer her on the morrow, her heart had already made its choice. Morning brought with it a flurry of activity at Harrington House. Evangeline had scarcely finished her breakfast when Lady Margaret's maid arrived with a message. The Dowager Duchess requested her presence in the blue drawing-room at her earliest convenience. She found Lady Margaret seated by the window, a letter open on the small table beside her. The older woman's expression was troubled, a crease between her brows that Evangeline had rarely seen. "You wanted to see me, Lady Margaret?" The Dowager looked up, her expression softening at the sight of Evangeline. "Yes, my dear, please sit down. I fear I have received some rather disturbing news." Evangeline sank onto the small sofa opposite Lady Margaret, a sense of foreboding settling in her stomach. "What is it? Has something happened?" In a manner of speaking, Lady Margaret picked up the letter, her lips pursing as she glanced at its contents once more. "This arrived from Lady Wrexham this morning. It seems your stepmother has been spreading certain rumors about the nature of your relationship with Alexander." Evangeline's heart sank. "What sort of rumors?" Lady Margaret's expression was a mixture of anger and concern. "The worst sort, I'm afraid. She is suggesting that your father's business dealings with Alexander were less than honorable, that your father essentially sold you to Alexander to cover his debts, and that your position in this household is not that of a ward but of something else entirely." "That's absurd!" Evangeline exclaimed, rising to her feet in indignation. "My father would never, Alexander would never." "Of course not," Lady Margaret agreed, her voice gentle but firm. "You and I know the truth of the matter, but society thrives on scandal, my dear, and your stepmother has provided them with a most salacious one." Evangeline paced the room, her mind racing. But why would she do this? What could she possibly gain from spreading such vicious lies? "Revenge, perhaps," Lady Margaret suggested, "for your escape from her sister's household. Or perhaps she hopes to force Alexander's hand, to compel him to offer for you to silence the rumors." Evangeline stopped pacing, a cold realization washing over her. "If these rumors spread, no respectable gentleman will offer for me, not Lord Thornfield, not anyone." I fear that may be your stepmother's intent, Lady Margaret said grimly, to leave you with no option but Alexander, or none at all. The irony of the situation was not lost on Evangeline. Her stepmother, in attempting to force her into a marriage she believed Evangeline would find repugnant, had unwittingly pushed her toward the very man who had come to hold her heart. But Alexander did not know that. Alexander believed she wished to accept Lord Thornfield's expected offer, and if these rumors reached him before she had a chance to speak with him privately as promised. "Where is His Grace this morning?" Evangeline asked, trying to keep the urgency from her voice. Lady Margaret's expression grew troubled once more. "He left for his club at first light. A message came for him just before dawn, something about an urgent matter requiring his attention. He asked me to convey his apologies to you for any inconvenience." The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. Evangeline had no doubt that the urgent matter was directly related to Lady Wrexham's letter and the rumours now circulating through London society. "I must speak with him," she said, moving toward the door, "before these rumours poison everything between us." Lady Margaret rose, catching Evangeline's hand as she passed. "My dear, a lady cannot call upon a gentleman at his club. It simply isn't done." "Then what would you suggest?" Evangeline asked, frustration evident in her voice. "That I sit here and wait while my stepmother's lies destroy any chance of happiness I might have?" The dowager's expression was sympathetic, but resolute. "I suggest that you trust Alexander to handle this matter as he sees fit. He is not a man easily swayed by gossip, nor one who would abandon those under his protection at the first hint of scandal." Before Evangeline could respond, the butler appeared at the door, his usually impassive face betraying a hint of discomfort. "Lady Wrexham to see Miss Blackwood, Your Grace." Lady Margaret's eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline. "Indeed? Show her in, Phillips." Lady Wrexham swept into the room moments later, her expression a curious mixture of triumph and faux concern. "Evangeline, my dear girl, I came as soon as I heard the dreadful rumours. Such a shocking business." Evangeline stiffened, her hands clenching at her sides. "Lady Wrexham, how kind of you to concern yourself with my welfare, when only weeks ago you were quite content to treat me as little more than a servant." Lady Wrexham had the grace to look momentarily abashed, though she rallied quickly. "Water under the bridge, my dear. The important thing now is to salvage what we can of your reputation. I've come to offer you refuge in my home until this unfortunate scandal has been resolved." "Refuge?" Lady Margaret's voice was icy. "From what, precisely, does Miss Blackwood need refuge?" Lady Wrexham turned to the dowager, her expression one of exaggerated sympathy. "Why, from the Duke's attentions, of course. The poor girl has been placed in an impossible position. Her father's debts, the Duke's generosity. All very proper on the surface, but now that the true nature of their arrangement has been exposed—" "There is no arrangement," Evangeline interrupted, her voice sharp with anger. "His Grace offered me shelter and sponsorship out of respect for my father's memory, nothing more." "Is that what he told you?" Lady Wrexham's smile was pitying. "My dear, naive child. Men like the Duke don't extend such generosity without expecting something in return." Evangeline felt her temper rising, a rare occurrence that nonetheless threatened to overwhelm her usual composure. "I think you should leave, Lady Wrexham. Your concern, like your sister's, comes far too late to be of any use to me." Before Lady Wrexham could respond, the sound of the front door opening and closing with considerable force echoed through the house. Moments later, Alexander himself appeared in the doorway, his expression thunderous as he took in the scene before him. "Lady Wrexham," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "What an unexpected pleasure." Lady Wrexham paled visibly, though she managed a brittle smile. "Your Grace, I was just expressing my concern for Miss Blackwood's welfare in light of recent developments." "Indeed." Alexander stepped fully into the room, his presence seeming to fill every corner. "How thoughtful of you. And what solution were you proposing for this concern of yours?" Lady Wrexham glanced nervously between Alexander and Evangeline. "I merely suggested that Miss Blackwood might wish to remove to my home until the situation resolves itself." "The situation," Alexander repeated, his tone deceptively mild, "being rumours that you and your sister have been instrumental in spreading throughout London society." Lady Wrexham's gasp of indignation lacked conviction. "So, Your Grace, I assure you I have done nothing of the sort." Alexander's smile was cold. "Let us not play games, Lady Wrexham. I have spent the morning tracing these rumours to their source. They lead directly to your sister, with your eager assistance in their dissemination." He turned to Evangeline, his expression softening. "Miss Blackwood, would you grant me a moment of your time? In private?" Evangeline nodded, relief washing over her at his calm demeanour. "Of course, Your Grace." You cannot mean to leave the girl alone with him, Lady Wrexham protested, her voice rising in affected concern. Not after everything that has been said. Lady Wrexham, Lady Margaret interjected smoothly, rising from her seat with regal dignity. I believe you were just leaving. Allow me to see you out. With no choice but to comply or risk further embarrassment, Lady Wrexham allowed herself to be escorted from the room, her face a picture of thwarted malice. As the door closed behind them, Alexander crossed to where Evangeline stood, taking both her hands in his. Forgive me for leaving this morning without speaking to you as promised. When I learned of these rumors, I thought it best to address them immediately. There is nothing to forgive, Evangeline assured him, her heart lightening at his touch. But I fear the damage is done. My stepmother has seen to that. Alexander's expression grew determined. Not quite. I have taken certain steps this morning to counter these rumors. Your stepmother and her sister will find their social invitations suddenly scarce in coming days. Despite everything, Evangeline smiled. You cannot simply banish them from society, Alexander. Can I not? There was a glint in his eye that spoke of power long held and rarely exercised. You would be surprised what a duke can accomplish when properly motivated. His expression sobered as he gazed down at her, his thumbs tracing gentle circles on her hands. But that is not what I wished to discuss with you. Last night, before we were interrupted, I began to tell you something. Evangeline's pulse quickened at the memory. Yes, you did. I told you that I had come to feel something for you that I had not expected. Alexander's voice was low, intimate in a way that sent warmth spreading through her. What I did not tell you is that those feelings have grown stronger with each passing day, until I can no longer imagine my life without you in it. Evangeline's breath caught in her throat. Alexander, when I made that promise to your father, he continued, his gaze never leaving hers, I did so out of friendship and honor. I had met you only briefly, but I remembered your kindness, your quiet dignity, your talent at the pianoforte. I thought that if circumstances required me to fulfill my promise, I could certainly do worse than to marry a young woman of such admirable qualities. He released one of her hands to gently touch her cheek, his expression softening further. What I did not anticipate was that I would come to treasure your company above all others, that I would find myself inventing reasons to be in the same room as you, that I would lie awake at night thinking of your smile, your laughter, the way your eyes light up when you speak of things that matter to you. Evangeline felt tears pricking at her eyes, joy welling up in her chest. I never dared hope. I had intended to wait, Alexander admitted, a rueful smile playing about his lips, to give you time to experience the season fully, to ensure that you did not feel obligated to accept me simply because of my promise to your father. But these rumors have forced my hand. He took a deep breath, his expression growing solemn. Evangeline Blackwood, I find that I no longer wish to be your guardian or your safety net. I wish to be your husband, not out of obligation, but out of love. Would you do me the very great honor of becoming my wife? Evangeline could not contain the smile that spread across her face, nor the tears that spilled onto her cheeks. Yes, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Yes, Alexander, I will marry you, not because of any promise or obligation, but because somewhere between that rainy churchyard and this moment, I fell in love with you. The joy that transformed Alexander's face was something Evangeline knew she would treasure for the rest of her days. With gentle hands, he drew her into his embrace, his lips finding hers in a kiss that spoke of promises kept and new beginnings. 2 months later, Evangeline stood before the altar of St. George's, Hanover Square, her father's miniature portrait of her mother sewn into the bodice of her wedding gown, as something old, something borrowed. Lady Margaret had insisted on lending her the Harrington family diamonds, though Alexander had already commissioned a new set as a wedding gift. As she spoke her vows in a clear, steady voice, Evangeline caught sight of her stepmother and Lady Wrexham, seated near the back of the church, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and poorly concealed envy. Alexander had insisted on inviting them, claiming that their presence would only heighten his satisfaction in claiming Evangeline as his bride before all of society. I now pronounce you husband and wife, the bishop intoned. Your grace, you may kiss your bride. As Alexander's lips met hers in a kiss that promised a lifetime of happiness, Evangeline reflected that sometimes, even in the darkest moments, fate had a way of leading one precisely where one needed to go. From her father's funeral to this moment of perfect joy, a journey she could never have imagined on that rain-soaked day when a duke had offered her his umbrella and, unknowingly, his heart. Are you happy, my love? Alexander murmured against her ear as they turned to face their assembled guests as Duke and Duchess of Harrington. More than I ever dreamed possible, Evangeline replied, her hand tightening on his arm as they began the walk down the aisle together, not as ward and guardian but as equal partners in a love that had blossomed despite society's expectations and a stepmother's schemes. Outside the church, spring sunshine bathed London in golden light, a fitting beginning to their new life together. And if Lady Cecilia Blackwood's face was particularly sour as she watched her once despised stepdaughter enter the ducal carriage as a duchess, well, that was simply the icing on an already perfect cake. The end. Thank you for watching. What touched or surprised you most in this story? If you enjoyed this tale of love and redemption in Victorian England, please like, subscribe, and share with others who appreciate historical romance. Another emotionally stirring video will appear on your screen shortly. Until next time.